Welcome back. Hello, this is our third lecture on meetings, and what we're going to be talking about is the process of disagreeing and also agreeing with others during the meeting. So let's have a look at how we might disagree with someone and also how we might agree with them. So the first set of expressions we're going to look at are disagreeing expressions. Now, it's very important in a meeting that we disagree in a polite way, that we're not going to be too direct, we don't want to be rude, we don't want to be aggressive when we disagree. As you know, most people generally don't like it when someone disagrees with them. So it's very important how we state our disagreement. So let's look at some examples of how we might disagree with someone. The first example we have is, I don't share your opinion, I don't share your idea or your viewpoint. If you'll recall from our communications lectures that we had last month, you can also change your to that. So I don't share that opinion. I don't share that idea. So I don't share is a nice polite way of just letting the person know that you don't agree with what they're saying. So I don't share that idea. I don't share that opinion. I don't share that view is something that you can say here. Now let me just say one other thing about I don't share. When you use the expression I don't share that, it can really only be used with opinion, view, or idea. I don't share that idea, I don't share that opinion, I don't share that view. Be careful not to use this expression with suggestion or proposal. So for example, I don't share that suggestion. I don't share that proposal. This is a little bit awkward to say in English, so you want to be careful not to use it with proposal or suggestion. Generally, it should be used with idea, opinion, view, or sometimes perspective. I don't share that perspective can also be used as well. The next one we have is, I don't think that will work. I don't think that will work. So basically I'm commenting on someone's idea or their suggestion. It won't work. It's not going to do what we want it to do. It's not going to be effective, and that's what I'm saying with this expression. I'm not sure I can go along with that. This is another one too. I'm not sure I can go along with that means I'm just not sure I can agree. I'm not sure that I can go along with that. I just don't think that I can agree with the idea or suggestion that has been given. I don't think I can agree with that. So I don't think is obviously easy to say. This is a very common, I don't think I agree with that. It's very direct, but it's also still polite enough that we can use it. And the next one I have is, I'm afraid I don't agree. Now the good thing about I'm afraid is it's a great way to soften your disagreement, to make it less direct, to make it sound less aggressive. No, I'm afraid I don't agree. I'm afraid I can't agree. Right? And so that also can be used, and so you see I've highlighted it in blue there. There's also a very polite, somewhat formal expression some people like to use in meetings when they express disagreement, which is our last expression, I beg to differ. I beg to differ simply means I have a different opinion. I have a different perspective. I have a different thought or different idea about what you're saying. So I beg to differ. It's not used often, but it is a good expression to know. It's quite polite. It's quite nice. Just say, I beg to differ. And then you would explain your reasoning about why you disagree with what the other person has said. So now we're going to look at some expressions for partial agreement. So the idea of partial agreement is that what the other person says makes sense to you. You can see that they have a good point. However, there's just something else you'd like to add or comment on, or maybe make slight changes to what they've said, but you're basically agreeing in principle. So let's look at some expressions we would use for partial agreement in a meeting. The first one we have here is, I see what you mean, but or however. So I see what you mean, however or but. So I'm acknowledging that their idea makes sense, I understand it, however or but I want to add more to it, or maybe I want to modify it a little bit. The second one we see here is, you have a valid point. So valid point means good point. You have a valid point, however or but. You have a valid point, however I still think we might want to consider delaying this event. Or we might want to schedule the conference for next month instead of this month. So again, the idea is acknowledging there's a good point, a valid point, and then adding your own ideas or your own modification to what they've said. The next one here is, I see your point, but. So I see your point. Again, acknowledging, good point, I understand it, it makes sense. However, but I want to add something else to it. Here's another one. I basically accept what you're saying. I basically accept what you're saying. However, or but. When you use an expression like I basically accept, what that means is you are not completely 100% accepting it, but basically in principle or maybe at its core, you think it's a good idea. But of course, you want to modify it, you might want to add your own ideas or additional comments to what they've said. The next one is, I agree to some extent or a certain extent. This is commonly used in meetings and used often. I agree to some extent. I agree to a certain extent. So it's like a definite partial agreement. To a certain degree, to a certain extent, I can agree to what you're saying. I do agree to some extent. But of course, you want to add more to their idea, you want to comment on it, maybe change it or modify it, and so you're allowing yourself the opportunity to do that. I agree in principle, however. So in principle means basically generally with your idea I can agree with the principle, but maybe there are some issues with some of the details or some of the specifics of the idea that again you'd like to comment on or maybe you'd like to change. And so you can go through and then add that after you've used this expression. And then the last one is, that's mostly true, but. That's mostly true, but. This one is also acknowledging that what they're saying is true. You acknowledge it's right. But, again, you want to add more to it. And by putting the word mostly, again, you are saying that not 100%, not 100%, but you are acknowledging that mostly what they've said is true, and you do want to agree to a certain extent with it, but you want to add your own ideas. So the partial agreements are designed for when you do recognize that, yeah, they've got basically a good idea. Basically what they're saying seems okay. However, you still want to add more to it, and you want to give additional explanation, comments, changes, or modifications to what they are saying. Well, let's move on to agreement. So when we want to agree with people in a meeting or our co-workers in a meeting, what are some common expressions we can use for that? So in a meeting, we'll hear expressions like this. That sounds like a good idea. Or, I can go along with that. Or the easy one, of course, is, I agree. That's a very simple one that we can use. Sounds good to me. This is often used as well in meetings. No objections here. This is sometimes used. If someone says, Denton, what do you think? Oh, no objections here. That means I agree. I'm not objecting. Now, the thing about the word objection, though, is you don't want to use it in the positive form of it. For example, I object to that idea. Don't use it in that way. That sounds way too formal. It sounds like something you would hear in a courtroom. But when it comes to agreeing, you can use this expression, no objections here, meaning I fully agree with what everyone is saying or with the idea or the suggestion or whatever it might be. I'm fine with it. I'm fine with that. This is another great expression. This is used commonly. Yeah, I'm fine with it. I'm fine with that. Again, directly expressing how I feel in terms of agreeing fully with the idea, the proposal, or the suggestion. I couldn't agree more. Again, this is giving your full and 100% agreement to the idea or the suggestion that has been made. I couldn't agree more. Now, the last one I've put here is one that is sometimes used casually in meetings, or especially business meetings, maybe in the United States, but some people will use this expression, sold. So the idea of this is that I've proposed an idea or proposal, I've given a suggestion, and you're agreeing to it. It's like you're buying it, you're accepting it. So sold, meaning that I'll buy that. It comes from the word sell, to sell, but this is the past tense, sold, right? Sold, I'm agreeing. So sometimes people just say that. Then what do you think? Sold, meaning I agree. I'm willing to do it. I'm willing to accept whatever the suggestion, the proposal, or the idea is. This is commonly used. It's a bit casual, a bit informal, but be prepared that you could hear this in some cases. Don't use it too much, but I think it is good to be aware of this particular informal expression that we sometimes see. Now let's go to a language strategy. As I said before in the beginning, it's somewhat sensitive to disagree with what others are saying. So we want to be careful when we do this. So when we disagree, we want to try to soften our disagreement. And one of the easiest ways to do that is by using the expression, I'm afraid. And we saw that earlier in our examples of how to disagree with someone. So let's look at some other examples of using I'm afraid to disagree with somebody. I'm afraid I had something different in mind. So that's an easy way to soften, I'm afraid I had something different in mind, and of course you would explain what your different idea is. Or, I'm afraid that's not how I look at it. I'm afraid that's not how I look at it. So I'm looking at it at a different way. I see it a different way. I'm afraid that's not how I look at it. I'm afraid I'd have to disagree with that. So I'm afraid I'd have to disagree with that. Again, is an easy way to disagree, but soften it by using I'm afraid. And the last one, I'm afraid I have a different perspective. So I'm afraid I have a different opinion, a different perspective, a different view. You can change that word. But again, you are expressing your disagreement, but using I'm afraid instead, so that you're not going to end up being too direct with the person or make them feel that you're not being sensitive when you disagree with their ideas or their proposals. One other strategy we can use for softening our disagreement is trying to reword our negative sentence so that it's not going to sound so direct and it's going to sound a little bit more polite. So let's look at some examples of what we're talking about. So for example, if I say, oh, that's a bad idea, that's a very direct statement, it sounds a little aggressive, it sounds very critical. But what if we reworded this sentence where it said something like this? I don't think that's such a good idea. Again, I'm expressing the same thing. I'm expressing that I don't think it's an idea that's going to work, but I've found a better way to say it so that it's not going to be so direct and so aggressive or sound so critical. So rather than that's a bad idea, I don't think that's a good idea or such a good idea. How about this one? It's a bad decision. So rather than saying it's a bad decision, we might say something like this. It's not the best decision. I don't think that's the best decision here. I don't feel that's the best decision here. So again, I'm expressing my disagreement, but I found a way to reword the sentence to make it less direct, a little bit more polite, but still I can achieve the same goal and the same purpose, which is to disagree with what the person has said. That's not going to work. Rather than saying that's not going to work, we might reword it like this. I'm not sure we can make that work. I'm not sure we can make that work. I'm not sure that's going to work. Again, I'm finding a way to reword my sentence so that it will not sound so direct and so negative. So these are some other ways in which we can usually disagree with someone but find a politer way or a nicer way so that someone doesn't feel criticized or feel like they've been disagreed with in a very direct and sort of impolite or even rude way. So that brings us to the end of this lesson. So let's just kind of summarize some of the things we've talked about. So in this particular lecture, we've talked about different ways in which we can disagree with someone. So we might say something like, I don't share your idea, I don't share that opinion, I don't share that view. These are common expressions that we can use when we're trying to disagree with what someone has said. I don't think I can go along with that is another expression. You can simply say, I don't agree. You could also say, I'm afraid I don't agree, right? Remember, using afraid is a good way to soften your disagreement. We also learned the expression, I beg to differ. It's a bit formal. It's not that commonly used, but it's a good expression to know. We also talked about ways we can express partial agreement. So with partial agreement, we don't agree 100% with what they're saying, but we acknowledge that part of what they're saying makes sense or it's a good idea. So we might say something like, you have a valid point, or I see your point, however, or but. I see what you mean, however, or but. I agree to a certain extent, or I basically accept what you're saying, or basically that's true, or that's mostly true, however, or but, and we can add that as well. We also looked at ways in which we can agree, express our agreement. So when we're in full agreement with something, we could say, that sounds like a good idea to me. I'm fine with it. I'm fine with that. You could also say something like, no objections here. We talked about that expression as well. We talked about sounds good to me, or simply I agree. So these are expressions that we could use to show our full agreement with an idea, a suggestion, or a proposal that's been made at the table. We've also talked about how to soften our disagreement. The easiest way to soften, of course, is by adding I'm afraid. I'm afraid I can't agree, I'm afraid I disagree, I'm afraid I can't go along with that, I'm afraid I have a different view. That's one way. And we can also look at ways to reword our negative statements so that they're not so direct. So rather than saying, that's a bad idea, we might say something rather such as, I don't think that's such a good idea, and then of course we could explain why. So this concludes our third lecture on meetings. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next time.